I wanted to thank Jackie and Rudy and Tina for organizing this evening. I feel it's a very wonderful kind of introduction to the broader queer community in San Francisco to be able to participate here tonight. And also to Juan Carlos and Lexi, who's going to join us, and to Sam Espinoza, who's hosting a book table for me where you can get some of the last remaining copies of Handbook and my new publication, the HIV Howler. So thank you for hosting the table, Sam. So I want to talk about two projects tonight, focusing primarily on Handbook, supporting queer and trans students in art and design education, and also drawing in some conversation about the HIV Howler, which is my newest publishing project that I just launched this summer. There's a quote from the theorist David Halpern that I love, and he says, "Teaching has always been the queerest profession." Right? I quote at the beginning of my introduction to Handbook, and in particular, I think that teaching art is queer because there's something about it that remains elusive and difficult to theorize. Teaching art is about creating critical consciousness. It's about moving from centralized power to personal agency, and it's about creating connections with people in culture through public discourse and exchange. This talk is called Queer Publishing as Pedagogy, but it could just as easily be titled What I Learned About Teaching from My Students and colleagues outside of class while trying to survive academia as queer and trans people together. We have a way better and shorter name, which is Queer Publishing Project. And I founded Queer Publishing Project with 3 of my students to become a network of over 100 people who collaborated to make this book, to make Handbook. So together with this idea that teaching art is both queer and elusive, this is where publishing as a form of hands-on experiential pedagogy comes in. Queer Publishing Project formed a network around the common goal of producing a limited edition artist book rather than replicating an institutional hierarchy. For me, Handbook was never an institutional project. It's not a policy or a piece of academic planning that we were told by somebody else that we should do. It was a bottom-up project that emerged out of a strong desire, took place within our studios that we worked in every day and taught in every day, and used the resources of the institution as a platform for critical action. This original impulse that still continues for many of us who were involved was to see and also to find ways to actually feel that the university could be an ecology that included students, former students, alumni, staff, and faculty, as well as members of a broader community who all together create a kind of like porousness and spaciousness around creative and intellectual conversation that moves beyond the walls of the institution. So the major effect is that together we created a model that shifted the idea of equity work out of offices and into studios, away from an institutional or administrative requirement of something that we should do, and towards a personal teaching and learning philosophy that activates places that we work in and make being teacher and student equally more fun. I want to juxtapose a few personal experiences in learning about how queer works or doesn't work within an art design school. Before I attended art school in 1999, I heard a rumor about being grabbed by lesbians in the bathroom. And I actually thought that that sounded pretty good. But the rumor instructed me that art school could fulfill my desires, but also that those desires were to be feared. As a student, I did cruise the bathrooms. I had one out queer professor. I wrote my first art history paper about Claude Cahun, and most influentially, for 2 years of my degree, I participated in an anti-racism, anti-homophobia initiative that involved students, staff, and faculty, and we all worked together at a variety of intersections. We analyzed policy, which as an undergrad I think was like quite an amazing undertaking. And we did programming. And that experience was the blueprint for all of the other equity work that I've done in my practice since then. As an undergrad, I met some of the most amazing people who were doing equity work more broadly. And Juan Carlos, I love that you talked about Dory, because she's the Dean of Design at the school I used to work at, and she gave us $2,000 for this project. And is a wonderful, wonderful dean. I bring that experience up because the anti-homophobia and anti-racism working group, like Handbook, offered me a model of coalition building that took place outside of classrooms. It was not a formal part of my education, but it was where I first came into my political consciousness as a cultural producer. So later, as a professor, as a white genderqueer professor specifically, my students started showing up in my office to tell me about homophobia, transphobia, and racism that was going unquestioned in their classes, and I often found myself workshopping solutions with them. Again, I realized that there was much to be done, and students had a lot to say about teaching. The things that they told me were things that professors desperately needed to hear, and nobody asked them, nobody ever asked them what could be done to change the environment. One day I got into a yelling match with one of my colleagues in our shared office, the place that so many queer and trans students came to talk to me. And this colleague of mine insisted it was just too hard to bother learning the new names and new gender pronouns of our mutual students when they came back from the summer. So I thought, until we have a confrontation or a human rights complaint, there was literally zero space for these conversations to happen. When I returned to the school I did my undergrad at, in 2015, I was the speaker at the commencement, and this again was reinforced to me. A student came up to me and said that they were transgender, or they are transgender, and it was the first time in 4 years that they'd ever heard the words queer or trans publicly spoken at the school. So, reflecting on these series of instructive moments really catalyzed my desire to do a project with students, staff and faculty outside of class. The spectrum from dead silence to willful misgendering that students experience is partly because many faculty see queer knowledge, queer bodies, and queer cultural production as inconvenient or besides the point of their core work. Many students have never had a transgender or queer professor, and those of us who do identify in such ways often compartmentalize our identities to keep our jobs. Which I'll talk about a little bit later. Yeah. So, for everyone, I come back to the idea that teaching art is a queer profession, regardless of your orientation, because the fact is that most of us learn to teach by doing it. Being in the classroom and the studio, sharing our personal research practices and experiences with our students, and trying interesting new things out every semester. Most of us don't read pedagogy books, and I'll admit that I did not read pedagogy books until I started this project. In part because of the belief that art cannot be taught. And also because most don't even come close to capturing the complexity of what teaching art actually looks like. One assumption that I encounter over and over is that good teaching and best practices are universal, regardless of how our identities and power dynamics collide in the classroom, and that we don't need to zero in on topics like queerness or transness or blackness, that good teaching is just good teaching. As I say in the introduction to the book, this guide is necessary because most education resources scarcely even mention the words queer and transgender. Our students don't hear those words enough in our classrooms, let alone books that put forward nuanced conversations about race. And coupled with historical exclusion, this lack of writing on pedagogy that includes identity flattens the experiences of queer, trans, and racialized students. In addition to that, most of these books are written by teachers and administrators who rarely set foot in studios. And almost all of them are ugly.
The books.
It's true, the books. The books are ugly. Pedagogy books are a particularly badly designed form. This guide is necessary, and this is for faculty members, because we are artists, designers, critics, curators, and historians, and we play a critical role in our culture. It is our job to make the most important, challenging, and beautiful ideas sensible, visible, and understandable. To invent new ways of being and new social configurations through the work that we do. Plus, we tend to prefer nice books. So, it was important to me that Handbook was a beautiful resource that appealed to the design sensibilities of our design faculty, something that people would actually pick up because it was kind of like too beautiful to be denied, just like Juan Carlos's presentation. But also that we can have nice things and they can be practical and direct. So, with this in mind, Handbook is designed around student experiences such as the first day of class, introductions, discussions, and critiques. Reading again from the book, the students and alumni who participated in this project dedicated countless hours to discussion, research, editing, and design sessions on how we can make art and design education better for queer and trans students. In 8 dream chats, very Bay Area, even though it took place in Toronto. In 8 dream chats, we awkwardly introduced ourselves, laughed, cried, wrote, and thought critically and in depth together. The dream chats were envisioned as an imaginative, collaborative, student-facilitated forum for discussion on pedagogy. Our goal was to create a practical guide that faculty at any art and design school can use and keep on hand. With that in mind, some of the questions that guided our work and discussions were, what do faculty and staff need to know about your experience as a queer or trans student? How can critiques be facilitated to create more productive, meaningful dialogue with profs and colleagues about your work? How does racism impact your experiences as queer and trans, Black, Indigenous, and POC students? And how can white profs and white students who identify as queer and trans work towards racial justice? Our aim is that by answering these questions, that faculty move from addressing issues or seeing queer and trans students as an issue to transform their understanding about how to support queer and trans students in the studio and the classroom. This is where I want to emphasize the process of artist publishing practice as a transformative pedagogy that's rooted in the idea that education should be a form of public discourse and exchange. At first, I personally thought that Handbook would turn into pedagogy when faculty actually read this book. It's like, as soon as they get it in their hands, they're gonna make it into pedagogy. But I realized that making and distributing Handbook, the process of actually doing it, was the pedagogy. Every conversation, every day in the studio, every opportunity for students to print and talk about identity or not talk about identity while they hung out with queer and trans staff and faculty. And also every time a faculty member who didn't identify as queer or trans came into the studio and saw the kind of undeniable energy that surrounded the project. Making Handbook was the pedagogy because it required care, attention, and relationship building to publish this piece. And that act of publishing mimicked the kind of gradual and daily practices and processes of equity work in a way that was really satisfying. As the process stretched from making a 16-page risograph scene, which was our initial aspiration, to a 120-page book with 3 color letterpress cover printed within the studios, our expectation changed, and so did the impact of the work. As we decided to move towards a more refined production process, we were forced to slow down. And we didn't complete the zine that first summer, and personally I'm really glad that we shot a little higher in our aspirations about what the project could be. Nick Schick, our production mentor, came up with the name Dream Chats to capture our imaginations about what we could do together, about what conversations about the future of arts education could look like. And the process of, the other thing that took a long time, in addition to printing, was the process of actively listening to students. Not through feedback forms, but through actual conversations. And in supporting their dialogues with each other. And this required a huge amount of care, as did the compilation of discussions into writings, of ideas into illustration, and of the production of the book as a handmade object printed on a letterpress, which is an extension of the care for the process. You pick up Handbook, and the energy and the aesthetic of the hand-printed form teaches you and reminds you to care about the topic. Opening the gatefold, you see the voices literally rising off the page into a chorus of conversation. That's that. So every time a dream chat, production meeting, letterpress session, or deadline overflowed and became longer than we expected, we had a couple of mottos. The first motto was, good things take queer time. And in time, I began to see the project as a very embodied antidote to the crisis culture of academic administration, where we, like as Juan Carlos said, where we work harder and faster and with less compassion for ourselves and our students. On the topic of other things that take time, we're often told that equity work and institutional processes are slow. But we understood with this project that when we have to wait for social change to happen, we know that inaction and complacency actually equals death, so we do it ourselves.
True, so true.
Thank you. I want to address the issue of equity as a form of emotional labor that's disproportionately carried by racialized, queer, trans, and female faculty members and staff. So deep breath for everybody who does that work. This is the pedagogy of love and care that we as faculty members need to learn to redistribute and carry together. Queer time is sometimes slow, so I get I get it. Like the beloved drag queen who's getting ready, or the art historian who patiently excavates material and lost records to rescue queer artists from invisibility. But queer time is also too fast. It's like the abbreviated lives of suicide, police violence, and the generational loss of elders wiped out through the AIDS crisis, or conversely, our unique ability to mobilize a glamorous protest crowd. When things took a long time, we often had a joke, our second motto, which was, kill me 3 years ago. Which is super funny and provided much needed comic relief, but there's also a real urgency in that joke, because we lose so many queer and trans people to suicide. And what other faculty members actually told me before I realized it, that this was a life-saving project, that our hope with this project is that our queer and trans kids make it into our art schools, let alone to graduation. So this is a project that recognizes the legacy of those who come before. One of our most beloved queer faculty members, who I worked with and was a mentor of mine and a friend of many of my colleagues, started the social justice program at OCAD, and she committed suicide this summer that we started Handbook. And she was in her 50s. So we're not just invested in saving our youth or making things better for our students. We also need to create ways to survive academia for ourselves and to support our colleagues, whether they're longtime profs, adjuncts without health coverage, or support staff who run the studios where we make, learn, and teach, but receive a fraction of the support for their fraction of the institutional support for their own artistic work. And recognizing this fact is what survival looks like in an academic context. So just as Handbook centers the voices of queer and trans students speaking about their experiences in studios and classes, the HIV Howler, Transmitting Art and Activism, does the same. It recenters learning and community knowledge transfer by actually listening to the experiences of PAWS people and creating a published environment where myself and my co-editor, Jessica Whitbread, worked really hard to minimize the aspects of gatekeeping and hierarchies that separate professional artists from people who use art as activism or for people who use art as survival. The Howler brings together 50 artists, activists living with HIV together, not in a gallery, but in a flexible, mobile space that can move across geographical boundaries. And we launched this publication this summer at the International AIDS Conference in Amsterdam, which is a really large cross-disciplinary gathering of about 15,000 researchers, physicians, lawyers, artists, activists. The conference, I think I can say this is coming to San Francisco in 2020, so I hope people will make some noise about that. But it was important for us in thinking about our presentation at this conference that we operate not from the perspective of providing services for cause people. As we say in the introduction, we dreamt of creating an artist-driven project that did not stem from or rely upon service organizations or policy initiatives that attempt to structure pause lives. We wanted this critical and emotional impulse to begin with us, our friends, our lovers, and our experiences together. The idea of a critical and emotional impulse is really, I kind of now see directly related to Handbook and to the idea of teaching as a queer practice. And the Howler even further decentralizes this idea of teaching, particularly in our visual mentorship, and in the formation of a broad international advisory committee who work together to steer the conversations that we included. We wanted to expand the conversations that were happening around HIV and cultural production, but also bring it closer at the same time. We're spread across many cities and many time zones, but of course, the daily reality of living with HIV means having many conversations, some of which are more life-sustaining than others. And we found the editorial process to be very generative. These are our members, me and Jessica are at the top. Beside her, or with her, is Laura Angeles Tomas, who's also from Puerto Rico. Charles Ryan Long, who's from Chicago. And then down in the center, Darian Taylor, one of the oldest AIDS activists in Canada, Mike Hickey, and Ted Kerr. So thinking about how to create equitable relationships of distribution and labor at the intersection of legal, medical, and cultural production. In our editorial, we say we want to redistribute the social and cultural capital and resources that accrue to create a more equitable relationship between negative and pause people. And that begins with an acknowledgement that draws from Charles Ryan Long's letterpress poster that's reproduced on our, as part of our editorial. And the top says, attention, people living with AIDS. And by that we mean everybody on the globe. So as we got together, we worked in 1 week in Amsterdam. We met in Amsterdam with a few additional members who were not part of the advisory, but who were contributors to the paper. And we met, we put together the paper every day, sent it to press at 11 p.m., received the copies in the morning, and then headed off on bikes to distribute 800 copies per day while we were in Amsterdam. So just quickly, a few thoughts on what is the Howler. The Howler, as a title, riffs on the idea of a town crier, a person who continues to do activism long past the point of being fashionable, the person who won't shut up, the person who discloses too much. Where artists, writers, and activists speak too loudly, are seen as disruptive, we see ourselves and the Howler as recognition that cultural criticism and AIDS activism are endurance practices. These practices require not only howling at times, but also a public expression and gathering together. When thinking of a subtitle for the paper, we focused on the word transmission, transmitting art and activism, because of its common meaning in HIV/AIDS dialogues, but also to get to the heart of what publishing does and what publishing offers and has the capacity to do, which is transmit ideas and dialogues and act as an embodied space for pedagogy. So in naming the paper, we wanted to change the terms of transmission to think of it as a powerful cultural force that enables survival and moves across boundaries, not as a term that contains paused bodies, but as a way to say, yes, this paper will move across platforms and reach people through transmission and through its historical continuity. This is a shout out to Nancer, who's a San Francisco artist. Rearticulate our work as a force that has historical continuity that can be traced back through printed matter that documents decades of activism. Most importantly, we wanted to think about what we wanted to put on the record about AIDS activism, not historically, but in the present moment. So I just want to end by saying I want to emphasize that as a collaborative and communal activity, queer publishing engenders and requires a kind of care towards content, form, people who you work with, whose work you're publishing. And like activism, it requires trust and can be seen as a form of endurance. So after putting out 3 issues of the Howler, and we are working on a 4th issue. We felt like going out with a statement like this that I'm going to read, we just could not stop. It didn't feel like it was time to close the chapter. So this is the end of our editorial statement. Here we give voice to artists and writers who resist the systems that seek to destroy us. They use art and cultural production as a tool that highlights our collective and historical power. The Howler is a new forum for dialogue, a demand for aesthetic self-determination, like Handbook. Aesthetic self-determination is really important. A response to tokenism, a space to dismantle our cultures of gatekeeping. It is a guide to navigating the vibrational ambiguities between policy, pathology, and community, between legal, medical, and social justice, dialogues, and cultural production. Just like the Handbook, the Howler is a gift to our community, piece to be circulated, passed on, archived, and above all, in considering the kind of intimate scope of the paper, we felt that it was important to read the paper in bed. Okay, that's all. Thanks.
Now what? Now we're going to sit on